We are now the most obese country in Europe. We also eat the most processed food in Europe. There is a connection, and whatever happens, we need to address that issue and produce healthier, and I would suggest more local food. We're quite happy to subsidise the NHS. We're quite happy, most people, to spend £100 billion on subsidising our health. I don't see why we shouldn't subsidise our food. After all, the cheap food is costing our NHS £10 billion a year in diabetes alone. So it would be sensible to spend another £10 billion producing good, healthy food locally. But to do that, we need to subsidise the labour to do it. Another aspect of those food imports is while we import half the food, we actually impact on the environment proportionately more. It means we're using twice as much land as we use in this country to grow food of other people's land in Africa, Asia, South America, you name it. Vast tracts of the Amazon have been taken out to grow soybean. In terms of the environment, in terms of land, we need to use our land better. In terms of the air, about two-thirds of our greenhouse gases, the carbon monoxide, dioxide, the methane, etc., are created abroad. And we discount that, we pretend that's not happening. So that's the land and the air, and the water is probably even worse. We can't get figures on the actual amount of water coming into the country, embodied in the fruit and the vegetables, but it must be enormous. And if there's anybody out there who wants to help me calculate it, please talk to me. But there is something called virtual water, and that is the water used to grow those crops, whether it's coffee, whether it's cocoa, whether it's vegetables. You can imagine they need irrigation, they need all sorts of watering systems in order to work. It has been calculated that 20 Niles worth, that's the river Niles worth, of water is used to grow the fruit and veg which is imported into Europe. As I say, I'd like to see the actual amount of water which we ship into this country, so a water-laden country already, from drought-ridden areas, and we see people starving to death because of drought in Ethiopia and the Sudan, and they are producing crops which we are eating here which are full of water. It's obscene. So, for example, when we drink 1 cup of coffee, those beans need 100 cups of water to grow in Kenya or Ethiopia. Cheap food is costing the earth, and I mean the earth. Because of the cheap food and the drive to increased efficiency, we are using the soil as if it is a template, not as if it is a living entity. We pour chemicals on, the plants do grow, but unfortunately it is not encouraging life under the soil. What this means is that we are losing 2 million tonnes of soil each year through erosion, either being washed off the land into the rivers or as dust into the air. Instead of which we should be capturing that and holding that soil, using more organic methods which encourage life, turning over organic matter and holding on to the carbon. So we're not only just losing soil, we're losing carbon from that soil. And if anything we could do to mitigate global warming in this country, it would be to hold on to that carbon. I calculated in the book that something like 1 to 2% of all our carbon emissions are coming from the loss of soil in those counties. But for some reason, nobody wants to talk about it. It is completely ignored. We could also use our moorland much better in terms of reforesting. That would also hold carbon. It would also stop flooding and improve those conditions too. And I would argue we would want to encourage workers into those forests and create a lot more jobs there as well. So this is all about what's called land use. We need a conversation about how we want our land to look, not just for now, but for the next 20, 30 years. And we have an opportunity to do that now, I believe. And I believe that if we don't do it now, future generations will look at us and wonder, what on earth were we up to? When we grow any plant, that plant traps the energy of the sun into the plant form, what we see as green. That has got lots of carbon molecules in it. We come along and pick the bit of that plant we want to eat. The rest of the plant then dies back onto the soil, and the soil animals come along and break that plant debris down into organic matter, which then gets passed back into the next generation of plants. But of course, that is also building up carbon in the soil. And the potential to capture carbon in the soil is enormous. There's a campaign in Europe called 0.4%. If we increase the amount of carbon in the soil each year by 0.4%, we would mitigate all the rest of our industry's climate changing capabilities just by holding that carbon in the soil. So we should be looking for methods of farming which hold that carbon. At the moment, what's happening is we're losing that carbon because either we're taking that plant off, we're taking too much of the plant crop away, or, and I think this is a very significant part, is we're killing all the weeds. What we consider as weeds as a bit of a pest actually are all little carbon capture and storage units. And each time they die, they're putting carbon back in the soil. And I'd love to see the calculations of the contribution to global warming of killing off trillions and trillions of weeds. So we want more plants, we want that debris back in the soil, trapped. I, as a soil zoologist, would argue that I don't just want it as carbon, I want it as living carbon moving around. And the little soil animals which I studied actually capture as much carbon as all the earthworms, which we hear a lot more about. So I'm all for moving carbon in the soil, little lumps of carbon moving around, called creatures. Push comes to shove, if we need pesticides, then we use pesticides. But as a last resort, at the moment, we're using a lot of them as a first resort, if what we call prophylactically, in case a pest arises, then the pesticide is already there. The most famous example at the moment is these things called neonicotinoids. Neonics is easier. These are the insecticides which are being, there's a lot of concern about because they affect the behaviour of bees. And Europe has put a ban on them, and the concern there is that with the behavioural alteration, bees might not be doing the job of pollination in the future. Part of the reason that is these insecticides are put into the seeds so that all the plants which are grown with them have these neonics in them, and that's affecting all the bees. I would be against that. If there was an outbreak of a pest or disease, I am not against the use of a pesticide against that. What I am concerned about is the use of these things just in case there's an outbreak, which is called prophylactically. We come across that in antibiotics. In the States, they use antibiotics on all beef just in case there's a disease. Whereas in this country, we use antibiotics when we're ill. And I agree with that. Same with pesticides. I agree if there's a disease, we use the pesticide. I just don't believe we should be putting it into everything just in case. A monoculture is where a vast tract of land is put down to one single crop. Instead of having a rotation where we have one crop one year and one the next, the single crop is grown every single year. What happens is that encourages a build-up of pests and diseases. The EU actually tried to introduce a measure to encourage rotation of crops so that there wasn't this build-up. But the government in this country said, oh no, that's too bureaucratic, we're not having any of that. Whereas in terms of pest and disease control, rotations are the best way to deal with them. You don't need pesticides. You reduce the emphasis and reliance on pesticides by the simple measure of rotation. So monoculture will have one crop continually and a single form of harvesting, rather than a multi-crop will have lots of different plants in that area. What that means is some of them protect each other, some of them will stop the diseases onto the other crop, But the trouble is with a multi-cropping system is the harvesting is much more difficult. A monoculture is dead easy to harvest. So you can use cheap labour and massive machines. That's what we've got on the plantations. One of the main aspects of the EU was the tariff system. That was built up over 30 or 40 years to put taxes on food coming into Europe, and it is intended to protect farmers but also food processors. So if you bought coffee, green beans, coffee, there was no tax on it, but by the time you roasted it there was a tax, which meant you could move the coffee around Europe quite freely, but anybody trying to bring roasted coffee in had to pay a tax. So this is a disincentive on people doing that. So there's a massively complex system of tariffs. So for instance, there's something like a 30 to 40% tax on lamb coming into Europe, unless you have something called a quota, which stops the tax coming in until, say, 100,000 tonnes of it. And I'm talking about New Zealand here. And already probably people are thinking, what's he on about? This is, you glaze over at this system of taxes. I've just mentioned 2 or 3. There are actually 2,000 agricultural tariffs on foodstuffs coming into Europe. And when I say coming in, they may have different tariffs from different parts of the world. So tariffs on bananas coming in from Commonwealth countries are non-existent, but there are tariffs on South American bananas. That's in order to encourage Commonwealth bananas into Europe than South American. That was something the UK managed to persuade Europe. So when we've sorted out those 2,000 tariffs, we've then got another 15,000 tariffs on food products. Your pies, your peas, your cakes, your biscuits. All of those have mixtures of fat, flour, butter, whatever, each with their own separate tariffs. So by this time, you don't need abacuses to try and deal with it. You need Google algorithms for each one. Once we come out of the EU, we step outside that tariff wall. And the question is then, do we keep those tariffs the same as Europe? In which case, there will be tariff walls on either side of the channel. If you want to move your lamb into France, there'll be a 30% tariff. If they want to move their lamb in, there'll be a 30% tariff. So there's a massive debate then to be had as to whether we keep those tariffs. Some people, like Wetherspoons, suggest we do away with all food tariffs. That would mean we'd have cheaper food coming in. But it means we don't protect our farmers and our food producers anything like they do in Europe. So we're at a disadvantage at that point. And Europe is subsidising their food and farm production, and we're not. You can see what's happened. We're going to have cheap food and our rural economies are going to go down the tube. We're not in the WTO. We have to be in the WTO to play by the rules. And there are 164 other members of the WTO, and it only takes one of which to blow a whistle and say, we're not having you. And I can assure you, we're not friends with all the countries in the world. And I can think that in China, for instance, they still remember our antics in the Opium Wars, and they still remember what we did. So just being in the WTO is not going to solve it. There's also an argument that the WTO is imploding, as somebody called Donald Trump, who you might have heard of, is taking no notice whatsoever of the WTO. He's putting up tariffs, he's doing whatever he likes. He's not playing by any rules, they're just doing what they like. But one of the examples of how the WTO works is, talking of America, they objected to India deciding to stockpile food. And India had a long history of starvation and badly nourished people, believed that they don't want to be at the whims of the market. Remember in 2008, 2009, food price rises hiked and people were on the breadline throughout the Middle East. So India said, right, we're going to stockpile food in that eventuality. America challenged them, and in the original part, India won. And then America challenged again. I think they lost. It went backwards and forwards. And it wasn't until India was threatened with being kept out of some big trade deal that eventually they had to succumb, and it was some sort of deal that only 5% of the harvest or something could be stockpiled. Same happened when China wanted to come into the WTO. They wanted to stockpile 10% of their food. And America said, no, you can't do that. And you think, what an absurd world this is, where we can't stockpile against the eventuality of hunger. And you think, why is that? And the reason is that if you've got stockpiles, you can play any market. You can respond and you can soften any blows in the market. But these characters, especially America, just want the market to be a gambling game. And so having stockpiles prevents that happening. So the idea that we can walk out of the EU into a nice, world where the world is our oyster, I suggest the world is more our lobster, as the man from The Minder said many years ago.